So far we know that VLAN groups get assigned to domains, but what exactly is a domain? Well, by the end of this nugget, we'll be able to define what a domain is, as well as how it participates in the fabric configuration in ACI. Now, if you haven't checked out the series called the ACI Logical Model, be sure to go check it out because we're going to talk a little bit about endpoint groups. And endpoint groups are the logical grouping of similar endpoints in the environment. Now, there's a Cisco document out there that says that the domains that we're going to be talking about today are really the how of the ACI fabric as far as how do endpoints connect. And we're going to find out that there are 4 different ways a client can connect to an ACI fabric, and as such, there are 4 different domains. So the first type of domain that we can configure is a physical domain. From an ACI perspective, that means that when we have a leaf switch, that something is connected into the leaf switch, an endpoint of some kind that is physically connected to that leaf switch. These are typically bare metal servers, and while they're usually directly attached to a leaf switch, they can go through another switch. And that's contrasted with the second type, which is a virtual domain. A virtual domain is when we have a virtual switch inside of a hypervisor. So the hypervisor being usually VMware, Hyper-V, OpenStack. Anytime we have a virtual switch that we have API access to, meaning that ACI can actually control that virtual switch on some level. So in our leaf switch up here, if we have a physical connection to a physical server, but that physical server is a virtual host, and inside we have a virtual switch, and we have virtual machines that connect up to that virtual switch, well, these virtual machines are, of course, virtual, and so they're part of the virtual domain. It's worth noting, by the way, that if we don't have integration into the virtual environment, then even though these are virtual machines connecting through a virtual host, this by ACI is considered to be a physical endpoint, meaning it's part of the physical domain, because it really can't differentiate between a physical bare metal host and a physical virtual host without integration. And now for the other 2 domain types. If we have extensions hanging off of a leaf switch to other parts of the network, meaning let's say we connect into another switch. It's not an ACI switch, it's an NXOS switch, or maybe it's even a Catalyst switch, and this is a layer 2 extension. And then of course we have endpoints hanging off of this switch or other switches that are downstream. Well, this is all part of what we call an external bridged domain. An external bridge domain is formed when we have a layer 2 extension outside of the ACI fabric, and again, these endpoints, they show up in ACI still, even though they're not directly attached to a leaf switch. Now, just as physical and virtual domains parallel one another, so do the external bridged and the fourth one, which is external routed. External routed would be pretty much the exact same concept. We have a leaf switch that has a switch hanging off of it, but maybe there's a layer 3 switch, or perhaps it's a router. Either way, it's a layer 3 extension to some layer 3 device. And just like the layer 2 side, we have endpoints that are hanging off of that layer 3 device. ACI treats layer 2 and layer 3 connections differently, and that's why we have 2 different domain types between the 2 different types of connections. Now let's come back to the endpoint groups that we talked about at the start. And the big question is, how do we assign these endpoints into this endpoint group? And the way we do it is with domains. So we map domains to an endpoint group, and by the way, we can assign multiple domains to one endpoint group. And that way, when an endpoint shows up on the fabric, we know which endpoint group it belongs to. So maybe it's part of a physical domain, and so it shows up on switch 101 and port 1/1 and VLAN 101. And so traffic showing up on that, we know is part of the physical domain that we've defined here, which leads us to this endpoint group once again. Or hey, maybe it's part of our virtual domain. And so we know that when it shows up on a specific port group within our virtual networking, that means it's part of this specific virtual domain, and again, same result, part of this endpoint group. And so here we can see, even as part of this example, let's say this is a database endpoint group. Well, what if we have physical database servers? Well, that would be part of the physical domain, and virtual database servers, part of our virtual domain. And they can be part of the same endpoint group because we can map multiple domains to a single EPG. Domains are a representation of how endpoints connect into the fabric. And by assigning domains to endpoint groups, we now know when a specific endpoint comes into the fabric for the first time, which endpoint group it belongs to. Now there are 4 different domains. We have physical and virtual, and then we also have external bridged and external routed. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.